What is the Labour Party for if it does not make lifting children out of poverty a priority? Well, let's be clear. The position of Keir Starmer and his government is that lifting children out of poverty is not a priority, and they are choosing consciously to drive kids into poverty and deeper into hardship and squalor. That's what today's King's Speech, which sets out the government's legislative agenda, confirms. Now, I get it. Quite the allegation to make, particularly given I'm centering this critique on the two-child benefit cap, which is a Conservative policy introduced by the former Chancellor George Osborne, who, in my view, has done more to wreck this country in the last 14 years than almost any other politician. What it does, this policy, this disgusting policy, frankly, and I'll set that out why, is ban universal credit or child tax credit for a third child or more. That is, social security entitlements to help with the cost of raising a child. It was introduced by George Osborne because he thought it would cause political problems for the Labour Party and to help fuel the toxic Victorian-era caricature of the undeserving poor to justify rolling back the frontiers of the welfare state. At present, 450,000 households are affected by it. Each year, more and more households have been affected. It drives around 250,000 children below the poverty line. It drives another 800,000 children further into hardship. In total, it's estimated to affect financially 1.5 million children. 57% of those kids affected have at least one parent in work. The research suggests that if the policy actually has official aims other than cruelty, then it has failed on those terms. If it's about pushing families into work, then it has failed. Again, it mostly affects working households, and research by the London School of Economics shows it has not impacted employment levels of those affected. Indeed, as the co-author of that research finds, that is Kitty Stewart, the Associate Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics, we found that rather than increasing employment, the two-child limit increases poverty and hardship, and this can actually make it harder for parents to take up work. Other research has also found that it hasn't limited the size of families either, if that's indeed the aim. Even if you were to take this moralising position, by the way, why would you support punishing children for the decisions of parents? Indeed, child poverty should be regarded as an act of violence against children. An estimated 4.3 million children currently grow up in poverty in the UK. Around 3.7 million children suffer food insecurity. Now, we have reports of children suffering from bowed legs and heart murmurs in Britain in 2024 because of malnourishment. We have parents skipping hot meals in order to feed their kids. We know that children who grow up in poverty are more likely to suffer from physical health conditions like asthma, as well as poor mental health. The evidence suggests that this poor health can last into adulthood. Indeed, research suggests that child poverty costs the UK around £39 billion a year, linked to adults having lower productivity and a higher risk of unemployment if they suffer disadvantages associated with growing up in poverty, as well as the additional spending on public services associated with high levels of child poverty. This is one of the richest countries on the face of the earth. It costs between £2.5 billion and £3.6 billion to abolish the two-child limit. Government expenditure a year is about £1.2 trillion. This is a tiny pinprick of money. Now, Labour could ask, of course, the well-to-do to pay more in tax if, for example, child poverty was a priority, but it has refused to do so. Keir Starmer is just committed to giving Ukraine £3 billion every year for as long as it takes, clearly considered a priority. But spending a similar amount of money to lift huge numbers of British children out of poverty is not considered a priority. There is the brutal, stark truth. It is a no-brainer for the Labour government to abolish this cruel as well as self-destructive policy. No other single policy would reduce child poverty in one fell swoop than abolishing the two-child benefit cap. As child poverty action groups say, the two-child limit is the biggest driver of rising child poverty. But Keir Starmer committed to keeping this policy. Last year, Keir Starmer said to the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg,
if you have more than two children at the moment, you don't get benefits. Would that change under a Labour government?
We're not changing that policy.
You're not changing the two-child policy of benefits.
This underlined Keir Starmer's moral bankruptcy. He clearly wanted to make this point because he thought it made him sound tough. What do you call someone who tries to make themselves sound tough off the back of driving kids, children, into poverty? Now, when the Tories were in power, every child driven into poverty because of this policy was on them. When Labour took power, every child driven into poverty because of this policy is now on them. This is now their policy. They are choosing consciously, voluntarily to keep it in place. Let's listen to the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, on BBC Breakfast.
I accept that people are frustrated and want to, change a lot of things that the Conservatives have done over the last 14 years, but our inheritance is dire. The Chancellor will set out in the coming weeks more of the situation. She's asked all departments to give them the frank information about what's happened, but we've seen unfunded commitments, we've seen the situation, the crisis in our prisons, so we have inherited a really difficult situation. But all I would say is look at what Labour's history and what we do when we're in government. And, as someone who grew up in poverty, I am not prepared to leave office, after a Labour government where we haven't made those significant changes. And child poverty is an issue for us, and we're absolutely appalled that children haven't got beds to sleep in at night. This is the 21st century. This shouldn't be the situation we're in, but this is the inheritance that the Conservatives have left us, and we will continue to tackle those issues.
Basically, the difference being offered by Labour compared to the Tories here is to drive kids into poverty, but to do it with a sad face. To go, "Aww." Now, I'd also note that the Institute for Fiscal Study said before the election that the nation's books were open, that everybody knew exactly what the state of the finances were, so Labour could not come into office and honestly go, "Oh, it's much worse than we thought. We've looked under the bonnet of the car." This is a desperate and dishonest ruse. It's not based in fact. Now, let's just listen to this question by the Labour backbencher Sarah Owen to Labour Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer.
In constituencies like mine, in Luton North, where over 45% of children are growing up in relative poverty, what reassurances can the Prime Minister give me and my constituents that he personally takes this issue very seriously and that his government will address it?
Prime Minister. Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and I give my assurance to her and to the whole House that I do take child poverty extremely seriously. I'm proud of the record of the last Labour government in reducing child poverty. It clearly had a strategy, and we will have a strategy, and I'm very pleased to have announced today the task force that will lead our strategy to reduce child poverty. No child should be growing up in poverty. And we will work across the House on that issue.
Now, I'm told that this question was lined up by the Labour front bench. Doesn't sound very unlikely, that, does it, given what you just heard? One Labour source tells me so embarrassing. Labour knows it faces a major rebellion over this, which is why it's responding like this. All of a sudden, it's being defensive. And frankly, going off what it did in the past as a Labour government, as though we should just blindly trust it, is absurd. Not least, by the way, because Britain's in a far, far more powerless economic situation than when Labour came to power in 1997, and Labour, in that context, have adopted Tory fiscal rules and a refusal to raise taxes on the well-off, which as things stand means a big black hole in the nation's finances, which needs to be filled just in order to stand still in our current catastrophic position. Indeed, in the manifesto it said, Labour is committed to reviewing universal credit so it makes work pay and tackles poverty. We want to end mass dependence on emergency food parcels, which is a moral scar on our society. So to try and head off a rebellion, it has rebranded this review a task force. Now, the Sky News political editor, Beth Rigby, writes, government announces task force on child poverty, not specifically two-child limit. Senior Labour MP, heavy hints are this will address two-child limit. Question is, when task force will meet and report on two-child, seen a step forward but not far enough or quick enough on specific issue of two-child cap. Well, as a Labour source tells me, this is just wrong, that they've already committed to review of universal credit that would include addressing two-child limit. Renaming it a task force is just another facade that kicks the can down the road. That is the problem here. The danger is the can is being kicked down the road until attention moves elsewhere. Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, has posted about how she convened experts and campaigners on child poverty to start work immediately on a new ambitious child poverty strategy. Why didn't Labour set that up in opposition? Why did they have to wait until they were in government? Why haven't they spent years on this already, coming up with a strategy? Keir Starmer became Labour leader over 4 years ago. What's the excuse? An excuse which isn't, we don't actually consider child poverty to be a priority. Like, we know all the NGOs involved all say, get rid of the cap. Now, some might go, well, Labour will get around to it eventually, surely. But that means keeping these children in poverty for what? Months or even years longer? For what end? Any genuine task force in child poverty would immediately recommend abolishing the 2-child cap, as all these child poverty NGOs say, given they say it's the biggest single driver of child poverty. What does Labour think months or years of investigating is going to do? What would it say differently? At best, this is political game playing, with the lives of children driven into poverty and hardship and squalor in Britain in 2024. By keeping this policy in place, Keir Starmer and this Labour government are driving children into poverty by choice. Those are the facts. Doesn't matter how angry Keir Starmer's fans, the most tedious online cult on earth, it doesn't matter how angry they get about these facts, they're still facts. And those who care, who actually care about children in poverty, should do everything they can to fight this. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments, your thoughts. Love to hear them as ever. Help keep the show on the road at patreon.com/ownjazz84. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.